Okay, looks like we are live. Welcome back to Mission Top, everyone. Mission Top, as I always begin these streams as of late, is a farmstead and ranch. It is the place where my family lives, and so it is kind of a representation of our family. My name is Gary Nuila, and it's also a place of ideas, in as much as ideas are important to our family and thinking about life and the process of life and trying to live out ideas and test them, see how they work, share our results with other people, and kind of really delve in. One good example I was thinking about the other day is how much this project of us living here and trying to do what we're doing is tied into one of my favorite books, which is Walden by Henry David Thoreau, which a lot of people kind of see as somebody kind of going off to isolate themselves and be away and then give his thoughts on it. And then they say, and it turns out he wasn't even really isolated. You know, people did his laundry and this and that, talking about Thoreau. But really, I mean, he tells you exactly what he's up to. You know, he's trying to go to a place and try to live deeply, right? To try to suck out the marrow of life, to try to find out what life is really about, so that when you get to the end of it, you have a sense that you actually lived it and you didn't miss out on it. And so, for all its pretentiousness that you might sense in there, that is actually what we're attempting, always imperfectly, but that is something that defines Mission Top, right? And today we are closing out a series that I have been doing called Understanding Manhood. And we have been attempting this series to, in a thorough manner, really investigate manhood, especially by delving back into societies, present-day societies, former societies, to try to figure out what has manhood been defined as. Has it existed everywhere? And the answer has been yes. In fact, in every known society, there's been this designation of manhood. And we've tried to look at the commonalities between them. We've kind of seen some differences in this process, and we've covered an awful lot of ground. And in this process, we have also been trying to formulate a definition through it, which has grown, or not so much grown, but been honed as we've gone along. I think gotten better. I see this definition as still not finished. I've told you many times it's not as elegant sounding as I'd like it to, but it's gotten better along the way, and that's the point. You know, that's another definition of Mission Top, trying to get better along the way, if you will. And so here's the definition we've got to thus far. Manhood is the earned status that society covenants to award males for bearing the public responsibility of producing the resources that society needs that are not naturally likely to be produced, most commonly by being a provider, a procreator, and a protector, but adaptable to the needs of society. And we've also kind of attached a symbol to this whole project, or kind of the development of one. I don't even have a great image of it along this way, but so you'll just have to kind of hold it in your minds. But that is the best one we've been able to come up with thus far, is the symbol of the oak tree, okay? Which kind of stands in there as a pillar of stability, a masculine version of a tree, and something that produces in many ways, both produces resources, but also produces the seed, the fruit that will perpetuate the organism, if you will. So today, in wrapping this up, we are dealing with this topic here of the exception. Okay, so it's by design, you could say, that I've left this as the very last thing. If I were to make the exception the focus of this series, as we try to understand manhood the whole time, if you're constantly focusing on the exceptions, then the main category that you're trying to find is always going to be in doubt. And you can very well emerge from the whole process saying, I don't know that there's anything really here, that there is any category we're talking about, because when you start just focusing on all the things that don't fit in the category, then very soon you have this cloud over the category itself. And maybe that's the primary lesson I'd like there to be in this episode, is that there's a reason we're leaving it here till last, and we're not going to spend a great deal of attention to it. It's worth focusing on. It's worth giving it its little space and its little recognition. But it is by design that we're not making it the whole focus of the series. And we're going to see how different societies in this process have handled the exceptions. Okay? And I think we're going to see ways in which it has been done poorly and maybe ways in which it's been done well, so that we can try to, again, extract kind of the things that will help us today to have some ideas of what is the appropriate, the productive way to handle exceptions. Because our society is very much enveloped in a moment where there's a great concern for the exception, for the things that don't fit, and there's a great concern to include these things that have been that have not fit, right? And these people that have not fit. But in the process, we are dealing with the exact thing that I've been talking about, where when you try to say, okay, what has been neglected here? What doesn't fit? Let's include that back into our main category from which things were excluded upon. But we are finding today that when you do that, first of all, you begin finding there's a limitless variety of things that don't fit. So as you say, okay, let's include this and let's bring it in. Let's include this and let's bring it in. We've done it. We've got our, caring, complete society now. Looks like there's some more that didn't fit that we've left out. Let's try to bring them in to the process, right? And you do this endlessly because it turns out there are endless things that don't fit into the main categories. And so then you say, maybe the whole problem was these categories, we just imposed them artificially and they don't really exist. There's no reason for these categories. Let's get rid of them. And of course, if you've been paying attention to the world today, there's that pressure on society to eliminate the main categories that have been there. And one of these would be, manhood, womanhood, okay? And so there's that pressure there from some in society. It's still very much the minority, but of course, for some reason, these voices get amplified, right? There's an extreme pressure and power coming from these voices to putting this pressure on society. But hopefully this series has served as kind of a reminder that when you look back and you say, wait a second, wait a second, let's hold on a second, because we look back and it turns out throughout history, these categories have always existed, even within societies that didn't have contact with each other at all. Why is it the case that they emerge again and again and again? And if we think that we are now so enlightened to just get rid of them, what if we're wrong? And what if there's some unintended consequences that come with that, right? When you eliminate these categories, you try to say, look, we'll just deal with all these, we'll include everybody instead of trying to have these exclusive categories. But in that, you very quickly find out that not all these things that you're trying to include work well together, right? Because by their very definition, they're the things that don't fit within other categories, and you find they don't have the same interests. And so very soon you have nothing, right? You carve up the world enough, and eventually you have nothing. And so that means you have no society, because there's nothing left to hold that together. There's no category, except for the notion of including everything. That, it turns out, doesn't work, right? So today, I've been talking in the abstract, and it's because, you get too specific on this and you risk offending someone. So this is all fraught with danger. So sometimes I may just talk in the abstract in order to kind of, for those that have ears to hear, they can hear, and those, and it's less offensive. But again, that's probably my main point I want to make today, is that there's a reason for the main categories. We should pay attention out in the world, out in reality, when primary categories such as masculine, feminine, man, woman emerge again and again and again, and maybe say, looks like these in some way are here to stay. Let's honor these categories. And then let's also recognize there's always going to be things that don't fit in the main categories, right? Out in the margins, usually. of things. We've talked a lot about the margin on other episodes. And so, what do we do about that? And the answer, one of the answers that I hope you also see is not the answer, is denigrate that which doesn't fit. Because you look back at the history of humanity, and that's so often been the answer. Whatever doesn't fit in the main categories, let's exclude it, let's denigrate it, let's call it bad, impure, other, and let's treat it poorly, okay? Whereas today, I think we're going to see some positive examples of how some societies have found a way not to include into the main categories these exceptions, but to say, hey, look, here's exceptions. This is part of reality. Let's make a space for the exception. Here's a category, exception category. And in fact, is there a useful purpose for an exception category in societies? Oh, yes, there are. In fact, there can be an honored, valued place for those that don't fit into the main categories. And then, you come to find, this works. Why? Because it actually maps much better onto the reality of the world, that all three of these things are always going to exist, right? So we'll see that. Okay, so with that, let's dive into the specifics of societies and specific ways that, there have been societies that don't fit into this main conception of manhood, and then we'll see what to do about it from there, okay? All right, so let's start out with, the book has two main kind of societies that it uses to show how not every culture, it starts out with the exception of a culture that doesn't have a stark difference between masculinity and femininity. Okay, interestingly enough, even in these cultures, the categories exist, but they're much more, they're kind of, there's a cloudy overlap. There's not this stark black and white division in between them. It's a phased kind of overlap, although the categories still do exist. So we start out with the nation of, or the island of Tahiti in the Pacific Islands. And there you see these attributes that just you don't see often in many other cultures, especially the ones that we've been talking about, as you've seen in this series. So there it's just as common to have women, for example, as men in positions of power. So there's women chiefs, for example. There's more examples of women like beating their husbands, right? Women playing sports. It's not the norm. It's not like only women play sports and only women are the chiefs and men are not. So it's not a complete reversal. It's just that, like I said, there's more of a blending, okay? They're more free and open. There's more free and open inclusion in conversation and sociality and social roles for men and women. Okay, there's not a lot of stark differences that, again, we've seen in different cultures at different times. Many observers, some of the initial people that visited there to these islands, noted again and again that it seems to be that there's something kind of virile kind of in the women, something kind of manly in the women and something feminine in the men. That some of the men kind of come off more as androgynous, right? Not so easy to tell, are they masculine, are they feminine? For example, again, these roles that oftentimes are more stark in some societies are more blurred. So the men are seen oftentimes doing the cooking to a much greater degree than other societies. There's not a gender in the language even. There's not these kind of gender divisions grammatically, the way in most languages that even objects and things like that are given a masculine or a feminine gender. And then there's also even no effort to protect their women in the same ways or fend off foreign intruders as with most societies there is. So, there's one of these very interesting passages here. I'll just read it straight out because I think it illustrates it best. Unlike the fiercely protective Truckees, which was another society in this book, and by the way, this book is one I've used profusely through this series, Manhood in the Making, Cultural Concepts of Masculinity by David Gilmour. Okay, so he says, unlike the fiercely protective Truckees, the Tahitians make no effort to protect their women or to fend off foreign intruders. In fact, the opposite is true, much to the shock and delight of Western observers. When the English ship Dolphin put in at Tahiti in 1767, the sailors were amazed at their reception. The native women, wrote the ship's captain, came down and stripped themselves naked and made all the alluring gestures they could to entice them on shore. Apparently, the Tahitian men had not only acquiesced in this behavior, but had actually given their blessing to it. Later, the French explorer Bougainville, who rediscovered Tahiti 10 months after the dolphins' visit, was so struck by the easy eroticism of the women and the connivance of their menfolk that he named the place La Nouvelle Cytherae. Cannot speak French, after the island where Aphrodite, in some versions of her history, first appeared from the sea. Bougainville writes, each day our men walked into the country without arms, alone or in small groups. They were invited into the houses and fed, but it was no light snack to which the civility of the host is limited here. They offered them their daughters. And it says, compare this behavior to that of the truckees. So in most societies, the women are kept away from these foreign people that appear, and the last thing that would be offered would be these women. So most likely on the employee satisfaction reports, when these ships came back to dock at port, I imagine in the customer service department they were getting favorable ratings on an employee experience on those trips. But anyway, that's just to illustrate kind of the lengths of how this society is a pretty different place than most in the world. And so this even extends to there being few demands on the Tahitian men in terms of kind of that providing role that we've seen that's expected, that men deliver goods into the public sphere so much that we've seen in so many of these other economies. And there's lots of cooperation generally in the economy, less competition as we're so used to in our modern economy, for example. And so they have, all these traits that very much differentiate them from other places, but yet they still do have a concept of man and woman. There is still this division, okay, and it is still distinct enough that it does have significance in their societies. It's just that it's more blurred and phased kind of together than most places. And then there's this other interesting feature of the Tahitian society, and that is the concept of the mahu. Okay, so this mahu is in one way seen as kind of the village homosexual. There's only one per village. Again, this is something you always seen in the characteristic of something that is the exception, is usually there's very few of these people. It's not like, again, if everybody fit into this category, this would be the main category, but it's not. It's the exception, right? And so it turns out as you look into it, there's actually several societies that have had this kind of character. So some see them as the village homosexual, but usually it's a transsexual who elects to be an honorary woman in the society. Okay, so I guess here in the North American Plains Indians, this is a fairly common occurrence. I have a word here that I'm not sure if I'm pronouncing right. Berdash or Berdachi is what it's known as, or this kind of person is known as. Muxe is another title for it, as it's known in some southern Mexican communities that have this kind of role. And there even there's a title of Zanith among Omani Muslims, I guess, either still do or did have this kind of designation within their societies. And so it's interesting because here these kind of exception people are more than tolerated in these societies. They're often highly respected. So that's interesting, right? And once again, I think rather than me just trying to kind of pick out the salient points, it's much easier to just read and kind of give you the description of how things proceeded with these individuals. A standout feature of Tahitian culture is the figure of the mahu, or village homosexual, an ancient tradition often noted by early explorers. Like the famous Berdash, or Berdachi among the North American Plains Indians, or the Zanith among the Omani Muslims, the mahu is apparently a transsexual who elects to be an honorary woman. More than simply tolerated, he is, again like the Berdashi, often highly respected. One early visitor, James Morrison, gave this account based on observations between 1789 and 1791. So just to show, this is a phenomenon that has at least been going on for several hundred years. They have a set of men called Mahu. These men are in some respects like the eunuchs in India, but are not castrated. They never cohabit with women, but live as they do. They pick their beards out and dress as women, dance and sing with them, and are as effeminate in their voice. They are generally excellent hands at making and painting of cloth, making mats and every other woman's employment. They are esteemed valuable friends in that way. The Mahus are practicing homosexuals, entertaining men and boys by offering sodomy and fellatio. Each village seems to have one of these transsexual characters, and only one, and he is always accepted without opprobrium by his fellows. Most Tahitian men consort openly with the Mahu when there are no women available and think nothing of it. Interestingly, unlike the other men we have looked at, the normal Tahitian men usually assume the passive role in sex with the Mahu, and they are quite open about saying so. Levi reports, males describing their relationship with Mahu tend to stress their passive participation in the relationship and the lack of symmetry, as the following quotation from Tony, an informant, suggests, "I was done by a Mahu in Papaite." Levi is suspicious of his informant's blasé attitudes about the Mahu, finding the custom problematic psychologically. And it goes on about this, what this guy thinks, it's more of an analysis by this figure Levi in this book. But that's just to illustrate, again, the way this was a normal feature of this society. And again, if you want to look more into kind of this phenomenon and what it was like in these different cultures, I'm sure there's similarities. I'm sure there's also differences as you look, to again this Mexican pueblo in southern Mexico that has these kind of figures amongst the American Indians and these different places that have had these kind of figures. I'm sure you'll find similarities and also differences among them, because that's usually what you find amongst different human cultures. Okay, so now let's jump from this Tahitian culture that, again, has these very different features. Let's jump over to the Samai, which is a people of central Malaysia who also have some interesting features. So these people are, what kind of characterized them throughout history is they're a very conquered people, like conquered once and over again with invaders. And their whole kind of culture has come to it has survived by kind of adopting a passive role. And so even their physical stature is tiny, and they have this tendency, this great timidity and tendency to flee from danger, violence. They look down on aggression, and even to sexual advances, for instance. And so one thing that characterizes them is that they are extremely intermixed ethnically, and that's because kind of other peoples come in and kind of have their way with them, intermix, as far as bloodlines and things like that. And so you have a lot of different looking people within this Samai people, but nonetheless, they've actually survived as a culture. And that's also very interesting, because oftentimes when invaders come in, they overtake a society, intermix as far as bloodlines, and one culture just gets subsumed into the other. Is oftentimes the case. You see it throughout history. So it's interesting. These people survived almost by being excessively passive about it and accepting the intermixed nature of their ethnicity. Okay, so again, very, very different, very very much an exception kind of culture within the world. They have no concept of male honor that you often see in societies. They love and they treat well any illegitimate children. Doesn't matter where these children came from, who was their father or mother. They are welcomed into the society, and they work very hard to cultivate this personality of non-aggression and non-violence within their society. So they even speak almost kind of like with a proudness, with a positivity about their own timidity and inferiority as compared to other people. So they'll talk about how, other groups around us, they're strong, we're not strong. And almost as if like they're kind of proud about that identity, even as they're identifying themselves as inferior. There's no sporting contests amongst these people, no competition, which leads them to, they don't want people feeling bad, right? There's no stress on personal property amongst them, and much more of a concept of sharing everything. But then once again, you look and there is division between men and women as far as a designation. And then there's things like, for example, only the men hunt, okay, not the women. And so there's all these things that differentiate them as opposed to other cultures. Once again, the women participate in government just as much as men. There's much more of this blurring between masculine and feminine traits. And yet, despite all that, there's still the main categories of man and woman among them. Okay, so these are some very interesting, some very potent examples of exceptions. And again, I invite you to kind of search out more, because even this book, he says, there's of course more of these types of exceptions out in the world, but because they're exceptions, they're more difficult to find. I'm sure since this book was pulled out in the 90s, there's probably been more documentation of exceptions. But the thing is to see that definitely they are exceptions. There's so much more the norm that societies don't act like this. And throughout this whole series, we focus more on those because they're incredibly more common. So let's try to take some takeaways from these two societies, and the fact that there'd be a whole society that exists like that. Because, again, the tendency today is like, oh, since we found an exception, that challenges the whole framework that we've built so far. There doesn't really exist this stark difference between masculine and feminine. I'm sure a lot of people, like modern people, look at the description of those societies with kind of a longing, like, oh, if only we could rise to that, to those levels right there, then that's exactly where I want us to be. Thank you for sharing that, because that's hopefully where we're headed, right? There's people like that. And I also don't want, in that comment, you can kind of sense obviously some sarcasm, because you sense from me that I wouldn't exactly feel that would be an optimal society. But that is because, and this is the main point, is that those societies are like that because you look and there's some very distinguishing features about their environment and their kind of cultural experience, how their culture kind of defines itself and its survival in the world, and especially that feature of environment. Because you look and you find, like in Tahiti, for example, there is not this culture of being threatened by the outside. There are abundant resources that were enough for the people, so there isn't this thing of other groups competing for resources and whatnot. And you see that overall, like in this kind of island paradise, there isn't as many reasons or value for somebody acting like a man in the ways that we've talked about, having to be a provider, a protector of perimeters, and a procreator. These things just are more, they tend to just happen naturally. And we talked, there in the definition, we say manhood has been about all the things that don't happen naturally in a society, that aren't just happening. So when you have these things just kind of happening in a society, well, you can see why that society wouldn't have as stark a division or need to define, hey, men, we need you to do exactly these things, which you could do really well in this context, right? And so you see why it would be mixed, but there's still enough, even in those societies, for there to be a reason why you see men and women as different. So that, like, you got to see both sides of that. The reason why they're probably the exception, but also in the exception, see that even in this very different environment, there still are reasons for there to be the main categories. And as I look especially at these overall categories, then these overall societies and how they're different, it makes me think this does a good job at explaining why today in our society we have these tendencies to see men doing the very same things and kind of the same blending as these cultures. Because in many ways, in prosperous Western society, where in fact we are having, despite the inequalities and stuff we see, we are having one of the most prosperous moments in world history, right? With the least amount of war, with the most money and prosperity and resources. There's especially in European and place like the United States and so many countries, it is extremely rare to find anybody starving. For instance, there is enough food for everyone, and oftentimes it's a matter of just like getting a person to go to the place where they can get the food. The food's there. It's just a matter of kind of strategy of getting people in the right places. So we are, despite the difficulties we still have and we hear about, we have this very prosperous society where it's very easy for individuals to, and males, for instance, to not have to do all these, dangerous and uncomfortable things that have been done in the past, and society has gotten along, right? And it's also the case that in the things that are valued right now in society, that are productive, which tend to be more mental things, right? More things of IQ and kind of mental processing power. There's a lot more opportunities for women in those domains, right? And so we see also things like many more women in the universities, not many more, but more women, outnumber men in the universities right now and things of that nature, because there's just these conditions in society that make it such that these stark divisions of the past don't make as much sense. And that's the case because as we've looked at, we see how a whole definition of manhood always has to do with what a society needs, right? That's what kind of distinguishes what traits are required from the men and whatnot. So we have been passing through this moment where, there were some articles, 5-6 years ago, maybe even a decade ago now, where it's a woman writing and saying, is this the end of men? Do we even need this designation again? Because things have changed such that we probably don't need them. But hopefully you can see that even though we've been passing through one of these moments, I think the better way to see it is that, as this kind of whole Western society, there hasn't been as stark a need to see this difference between men and women, and that's why we've seen the trends there are. But if you zoom down to individual societies, a family or a community or a church or things like that, that very much these places that are kind of the communities that will decide who are the men and who aren't, there is still the need for these things that we've been talking about in this series of manhood, these three basic categories of providing abundantly and protecting perimeters and procreating, right? And procreating and being a lover that can satisfy and fulfill women that way. I mean, these things have not gone away. They're not going to go away. And our society as a whole could very easily move into a moment, right, where these categories of the past are very much needed from men, these things that they can do exceptionally well, such as if there were, a giant military conflict, then I think very quickly you would see this appreciation back to a masculinity that kind of treasured the warrior virtues of men and stuff in society, because that's what society would need at that moment, right? And so you see this is how it works with manhood, and these societies kind of give us a good indication of that, right? Okay, so then let's get into the other exception categories. Before we do that, I see we have some comments in here, and so I want to look at those, and then we'll move on to kind of, okay, well, how about these individuals? We've kind of talked about a society that is an exception society and why that might exist and what we should think about it. Let's get into these individuals who don't fit. And then we have, after that, the other part of this thumbnail that I put in, which I'll explain why I chose this image. But it's this other thing of not those that don't fit in as, in terms of the game and the category, but rather those that don't measure up within the category, because that's a whole other thing I want to consider today. Okay, so Christian says, in every other area of life, we study the general rule and then the exceptions, anatomy, grammar, economics, but like you say, we shy back from that in this case. So back when we were talking about that, and yes, that our society is just having this moment, but even though we're having this moment, you can see how it's already producing, there's these funny things happening out in society right now, such as, at the same moment, there's this inclusion of all these different categories that try to challenge the main categories, such as, masculine, feminine, man, woman. Well, then in the process of including the exceptions, so like, let's say, okay, look, we're now at this moment really focusing on trans individuals. Well, interestingly enough, right, when you come to trans individuals, you find that so many of them are actually pushing for a kind of hyper categorization of these old categories, masculine and feminine, right? So a trans man is a trans woman especially is trying to be kind of this extreme version of femininity, and you don't see it as much on the trans man side, but to an extent. And so society is having to now deal back. It's like we're having a moment where traditional masculinity and femininity have to again be considered because of the fact that we're trying to include these exceptions. And so again, that's our world. It's this very weird time where in this great churn and fracturization, sometimes the fracturing almost turns back against itself and pushes things back to the main categories. So it's just one of these fun, and again, I put ideas where credit are due. This is one that I heard from Jonathan Pageau the other day. I was just like, yeah, it is incredible how these things work and are playing out in society, right? We saw kind of the same thing with religion, where in the moment kind of happens where the atheists, these popular atheists had their moment and really did a good job at challenging things, but to the degree that it reaches kind of an end so much that it almost turns back against itself when people start realizing the contradictions. And I think now it's still the case that people are leaving religions, but there's this growing movement of people that are seeing, many who were atheists before, who are now seeing the need for something like a religious framework as just something fundamental and necessary in life. So very exciting time to be alive. I guess that's the way to put it, right? So Christian said, super interesting, got to get this book. Yeah, and again, the reason I've used this as the foremost text in this time is I've read a lot of texts on manhood. There's these ones that I've shared with you that if you kind of search best books on manhood are the ones that will come up, like King, Warrior, Magician, Lover, and The Superior Man and The Way of Men, and all these kinds of things that all have something to contribute. Iron John. There was kind of this moment, I guess, in the 90s, I think it was, where there was this kind of moment of focusing on manhood, and you'll find a lot of the books emerging at that time. But after reading so many of them, and even the new ones that come out, I keep on coming back to this one because there's no other book that has looked at actual societies, and given example after example of real world societies. Most of those other books deal in terms of archetypes and kind of psychological categories and stories and things like that, which are all useful, but it's awfully nice to be able to point to kind of real world examples of how things have played out. So again, I think, Martin, you're saying, what's the name of the book? Manhood in the Making, Cultural Concepts of Masculinity by David Gilmour. And I'm very positive you can still get it on Amazon, even though it's kind of an old book by now. So it'd kind of be cool if somebody even went further than this, because you've heard me kind of come back to a lot of the same societies. It has a lot of examples, but it's also kind of limited in them. Of course, today, the danger would be that the kind of people doing these kinds of research are so often so biased in what they're trying to see out there in the world that maybe it would be very hard today to get something kind of this caliber, where you don't get the feeling like he had an axe to grind in all of this. Maybe some people would say he would, but I don't get that feeling from him. Okay, so with that, let's turn to some of these exceptions and how to kind of see them in society. So in this thumbnail, here I've included this image of Caitlyn Jenner, a trans woman, and so from a perspective of manhood, I don't want to try to solve any of these, try to put out there solutions for these exceptions, because again, part of what I'm trying to say is that the exceptions are going to just exist always regardless. But I think one thing we can see about this is like in terms of just manhood and whether we can include someone like Caitlyn Jenner to try to include them in manhood. The easy answer is no, and it shouldn't even be tried to be included in any way, right? Because by the definition, these are individuals that have, are clearly saying like, I'm not interested in playing the game of manhood. And we've kind of talked about how it's a game and so you'd say, okay, fair enough. And you wish them well on their way of whatever it is they are pursuing, but that's kind of an easy case because they're not even asking to be included. In fact, they're trying to draw a stark division that they don't want to be included. So that's a very easy case. But how about the opposite of that? That would be the trans man, somebody that was born biologically a woman, but now wants to be defined as a man. And I also think that that's one where you don't even have to create an exclusion category. You just say, look, okay, here's the rules of the game of manhood as we've defined it, right? And it's pretty stark. Here's what you'd have to do within some culture to be considered a man, as far as we've been talking about it, a real man, somebody who what we're getting at when we say you need to be a man. So it's not just this marker, obviously, of sex, but it's a status that one gains. And so as far as I look at it, the requirements are there as we've defined them of what it takes to be a man, and we've laid them out in these societies. And if a trans man wanted to try to earn that status within a society, well, I think they could go for it, right? And try to earn that status and you could see if they could approach it. So even in that sense, I don't think that there needs to be some stark like, oh no, you can't do this, right? And that's where we see like in these societies that have this kind of third gender exception category, it's for those people that are kind of saying, I don't want to be included in the main category. And I'm trying to be something different. And so that's the other way to see this, is for those that are trying to transmit, I'm not trying to be part of the main category or something, say, okay, yeah, good, here's this place, and we can have you a place of honor. Now, obviously the Tahitians were doing that in one way, and these societies in another way, and they had their way of handling that. Like, I don't have great recommendations on how you would go about doing that today in society generally, because our society is so massive and huge. I think that's where these kind of things have to be handled down at more local levels, and figuring out how these kinds of people could work within that particular community. My faith tradition in dealing with this very issue right now, because for example, a lot of more conservative faith traditions kind of had the thought right initially of either come into the main categories or you're out, right? And there's very often kind of a denigration of those people that are out, and they feel it, and other people feel that there's that denigration of them. And so even a lot of cultural or conservative communities have felt, okay, all right, that's not the answer. We need to love these people. We need to show them the respect that is due anybody in humanity. But then that's where a lot of people get stuck, is like, how do you do that? And some people say, well, you got to include them in. They get to come into the very center of our tradition, and hence we need to adjust this and adjust that and adjust this so that they can fit. And that's where we get back to the main point of this episode. If you try to do that, right, if you try to bring these people into the center of the main categories of your tradition, you're going to adjust things such that you'll very quickly find that you probably don't have a tradition anymore, right? Because there will always be another exception that you need to add and adjust things to. And so, let's say, again, using my particular faith tradition, there hasn't yet been figured out kind of the way to have this third category for exception and have them be in an honored place where they're there as the exception, as the margin, you could say, but have an honored place. And that hasn't been figured out. And so there's still this tension. going on, even though, and that's one of the reasons I want to bring this up, because I think there's not even the idea out there that there can be such an arrangement. And it's very cool to see that some communities and societies have figured this out and been able to hold together the tradition while still treating, the exception kind of people with respect. And so I at least like that possibility out there, right? Okay, let's get to another one of the kind of the main versions of exception people as pertains to manhood, and that would be a gay man. How should manhood kind of relate to that person? And once again, I would say, well, ask him what he wants, right? Because there's many people in that position that kind of don't want anything to do with the traditional categories. And again, I'm a pretty libertarian person. I kind of want people to be able to have the space to pursue their idea of fulfillment. But if it in that, there's a lot of different types of gay men, right? And some say, I do still want to be a man. I would still like to enter into this category. Can I still fit? And I would say, as far as manhood, as far as I look at the definitions and the requirements generally, say, yeah, of course you can still fit, right? What do you need to do? Well, here it is. You need to publicly produce great value for society. And you can see how in the provider role, that's very open. In the protector role, that's still very open. We've talked about how there are different categories of ways that men can protect the boundaries of society, the perimeters. But also then there's the procreative role. And you say, okay, well, what about that one? There seems to be the one that can't be included. And even in that one, that's where I kind of get into this concept where, we have this notion today that just because we have passions or desires within us, that those, just because we have them, should be like accepted as kind of the ruling force of our identity, right? And I would say, that's not the case at all. Of course, all of us have things that we desire, ways that we'd like to behave, that oftentimes we say, I'm not going to let you kind of lead out in terms of who I am as a person, and I'm going to make you fit within a higher conception of what I'm trying to be as a person. So I still think it's very much the possibility, if such a person wants it, that a gay man could enter into a procreative relationship with a woman. And I've seen it happen actually various times. I'm not a fan of these kind of places that try to say, no, you can get that guy to reverse his desires, these kind of conversion therapy kind of things. I think on the whole, a lot of people have seen, that's not the way to approach this necessarily. But I have seen, again, gay men that have these desires saying, like, this is just one of my desires among many, and I have a higher conception of what I want in life. And if it's manhood that they want and that status in society, and they want to have a procreative relationship with a woman and have a posterity and things like that, folks, I've seen it happen and seen it work. Some people say, no, it'll never work. Look at the divorces that come from this. And I'll say, yes, people get divorced in many situations, but some other people also do make it work by putting their desires and passions in a hierarchy of higher things that they want, and that couple figures it out, right? As far as them, and it'd be nice if society would encourage them in their desires if that's what they want to do. So there's that. But even then, let's say a gay man says, I know I couldn't do that. I know I couldn't make it work. That's where I'd also say within the conception of manhood, it's not the case that you have to fulfill each one of these main categories perfectly in order for society to deem you a man, right? So if you just can't enter into a procreative relationship with a woman and that wouldn't turn out for the good of everybody, fair enough. And so there's all these other ways that a gay man could produce tangible benefits for society. And which society? Well, whatever society he's trying to be a man in, right? It could be defined so many different ways, whether it's just his local town, whether it's his group of friends, whether it's whether it's his faith tradition, whether it's society as a whole, the whole American society. There at all those different levels, you could try to be a man at those levels and not like perfectly fulfill every different way that you could benefit society, right? There's that space. So that's where I'd say, as far as manhood and as it relates to gay men, you'd say, hey, it's open to whoever wants to fulfill these kind of requirements within the society that they want to be designated a man by. Because at the end of the day, it's the society, it's the culture that designates you a man, not yourself. Okay. And then, of course, we could keep going and go into all the different kinds of exceptions we can imagine. Somebody who's a eunuch, if those still exist, they did anciently. Somebody who's a hermaphrodite. Again, we could keep on going because we'd be here all day because there's just endless exceptions. But I hope at least you can kind of feel the spirit of what I think, how manhood could approach these exception people today by saying, look, if you think you can make it within this framework, okay, there's the invitation. But if not, well, then we're not going to denigrate you anymore, as has been the case in the past, because that's always kind of been the problem of the past, the denigration of the other and the exception. And let's try to find some other way for you to be honored and productive in society. And that's where I'll get kind of to this next category before we move on, which is the person that just can't measure up to the requirements of manhood. Okay, so I'm going to come back and just look. Looks like we've gotten some new comments. Looks like Hugo is back. Thanks for being here again, Hugo. Yeah, I remember we were talking about that yesterday. So yeah, we're saying I do have Instagram. Just look for Mission Top and on Instagram and you'll find it. It's much less about these kinds of things. It's just little glimpses of my family, what we're doing in here, but you can find us on Instagram. So Christian, I know a guy who's sexually attracted to men, but who wants to marry a woman, have a family. It's all quite complex. Yes, so I'm not trying to say that anybody can do this. It's all just easy and that. So for sure it's complex. Like I wouldn't say anyone, and for sure I'm not telling anybody what to do, because everyone has to deal with the situation of their own life and the complexities of their own life. But I do also think that it's still a possibility that somebody who wants to be a man in the way that we have defined it in this series could definitely achieve that. If that became their aim, if that became the thing that holds them together as a person, or at least one of the things at which they aim all their different parts of themselves, passions, spirits, aspirations to, right? So Christian says, when you say a person who doesn't measure up, is that the Cain Commodus figure? Okay, so let's get into that. And so the person that doesn't measure up, the reason I chose this image is actually just in my mind because it is from The Man Who Shot Liberty Valance that we were talking about the other day. Again, just an excellent show about manhood, because even within this main two figures who are John Wayne and Jimmy Stewart, that it's kind of getting you to ask who's the man. It presents in this town a bunch of these other characters who are most of who are men, and you have to ask like, oh, is that person a man too? And Westerns are so good at this. It's one of the things you can nearly always do with the Western is ask who's a man in this society, who's the real man, right? And so there's this figure of this pretty grown up guy in here who just acts like a boy, throughout the film. He's still kind of under the thumb of his dad. This is a picture of him at the political convention where they're electing somebody, and he's there, sucking on a lollipop. His dad looks at him and throws the lollipop to the ground, and he just pulls another one out of his jacket and keeps on sucking on this lollipop. So, I thought he was a good representation, a nice, good fictional representation of somebody who definitely is not measuring up to the standards of manhood, right? And this is something very real and something very common in society today. There still does exist, even if it's not clear and articulated in people's minds, what a man should be. And we know that there are so many males who are not living up to that. And so, I've said before that one way of looking at it is this, to tie this into womanhood. Well, these males are like women then, and that's not the case at all, right? At least it shouldn't be. Instead, you should see the people that don't measure up are the man-child, right? They're the boys. They remain boys. They're the males who inevitably have a dependent relationship on parents and especially their mother, right? And then they remain in that relationship, dependent kind of nursing relationship to a mother throughout their life. And whether that mother is their literal mother or whether that mother becomes kind of society, which can very easily become the mother. And I'm going to talk about that in this On the Waterfront video that we'll have out here in the next couple days. Either way, it's this child, this boy-mother relationship that they remain into, okay? And so it doesn't matter that their bodies might have nice big broad shoulders and stuff. There's this great line in another Western, High Noon, which I have a video essay on that I kind of would almost like to have another crack on. But it's this woman who's kind of had this boyfriend relationship with this guy. His name's Harvey, and he's played by Lloyd Bridges. And at this kind of crucial part of the movie in this Western, she says, you're a nice boy and you've got nice big broad shoulders. But guess what, Harvey? It takes more than nice big broad shoulders to be a man. And she talks about the main character, Will Kane. She says, he's a man. And the whole movie is in essence about how when it comes down to it in this town, there's only one real man in that whole town. And it's this character, Harvey, even though this other guy, Lloyd Bridges plays, he wants to be a man, but he keeps on acting like a boy. He doesn't measure up, and it's not about physical stature, right? So what do we do here? How do we handle these people, these males, these boys, these man-childs that don't measure up to this definition of manhood that we set out? Because by definition, it's difficult, right? And you just have to think back to what we've focused on in terms of the rites of passage to see that, becoming a man in most societies throughout history has been excruciatingly difficult, painful, physically painful, has put you through ordeals, and there are going to be males that don't add up. So what to do? And we've seen throughout this book that the common answer throughout history has generally been to just kind of cast them out again, to denigrate them, to call them children, and to not give them the privileges of society, and to essentially cast them out. And they don't get the women, and they don't get married, and they've got to go out there and fend for themselves and do whatever, right? That's kind of generally been the answer. I'm sure it's not in every case, but you see that in the language of how these guys are treated, that is how they're seen. And we see that even in society today. That continues to be the general attitude towards guys. And why? Because they're essentially parasites. If they were a man, they would be producing more than they consume. But a parasite consumes more than they produce. And so who likes that? Nobody likes that. No family likes that. No wife likes that from a husband. No town likes that from guys in their town. And so of course there's going to be this denigrating language towards them. And so, well, what's the ideal then? How should we handle this, right? And that's where all I can say is that, the only other solution I have to offer that is the Christian solution. I mean, this is how Christianity has changed, has invited the world, and sometimes even, tried to kind of impose on the world a different way of looking at these types of situations, right? You can see that in these societies, many of which were non-Christian, the answer was, if something doesn't measure up, if they can't get into the main category, cast it out and call it rubbish. That's the most common moniker given to these guys: rubbish men, rubbish men, garbage men, and so you cast it out with the other garbage, but of course that's not what Christianity demands. And even today in at least my society, American society, whether it's Montana, certainly Montana, underlying everything still is a Christian society, right? And this is where we get into that agape kind of care or love that we've talked about in the other episodes. When it comes down to it, if you want to actually be a Christian society, you have to look at the people who are the non-persons, right? And so one of these rubbish men would be a perfect definition of a non-person. They didn't measure up to full personhood. The full personhood is the man, right? That status through which you cross that threshold and you've kind of reached full personhood as a male in society. And they don't measure up, so they're the non-persons. So the ones that haven't reached up. And Christianity says, with those people, instead of casting them out, you've got to go to them, and through an agapic process, you try to get them to become full persons wherever they're at. And sometimes, due to the limitations of the physical world, whether disabilities, whether, mental health and things that have happened to people through their lives, mentally, you're only going to get thus far. But at the very least, you can engage in the process, right? So what does that mean? Well, you may have a close family member like this. You may have a neighbor next door like this that's one of these rubbish men that doesn't measure up. And so what if you want to be a man, right, in a kind of Christian sense, what should you do? And that would be my answer, is that you go and you encourage, right? And so here's the cool thing, is that maybe they haven't measured up as a man at the level of society that you have, right? Maybe in your faith tradition, there's kind of there's the men in your faith tradition, or maybe in your town, there's the men of the town that have met that mark and others haven't. Well, like I said, the designation of manhood comes from society, okay? And if you haven't met it at one level of society, well, you can always come down to a different level, and maybe you can meet it at a different level of society. So take, a rubbish man, you could say, that sits in his basement all day and plays video games and offers really nothing productive to society. Well, at the very least, maybe he has some friends that he does that with, right? And so if you were trying to encourage one of these rubbish men, which we should probably just stop calling them rubbish men and say these males, well, we can still just call them men that are trying to be real men. If you're trying to encourage one of these men, you could at least try to find this way in which he could be a man. So maybe, again, he has some friends, right? And occasionally they do like to actually, take off the headset and turn off the Xbox or whatever and get together. And so with men, you could be the man, right? And how would you do that? Well, how about, you work a little bit, you raise some money, and then when you get together with your friends, you fulfill this role of manhood, of being the provider, right? The abundant provider. So if you were the friend that showed up with, a steak, a ribeye, for every single member there, and you said, here you go, guys, this is for you, then, in that moment, right, you are the man. And they would be like, yeah, you're the man, right? Because you've done something for that little society right there. It is how manhood works. If we defined it, you always are doing something for the society in abundance, an abundant good thing for that society that's undeniable in the public, right? In that sphere. So you see, in that moment, that guy, he's been a man for the level of society that he could handle on, right? And usually that feels pretty good to a guy. And so you look to try to encourage that, and level up, you could say. If he can start doing it for his friends like that, maybe he could start doing that for his immediate family. Maybe he could start doing that for his extended family. Again, within that group of friends, maybe he could be the guy that again, through your encouragement or something like that, actually starts to ask some girls out on dates and has some success. And then again, in that group of friends, he's, the Don Juan. He's the guy, whoa, look, you did it. You actually got a date, you got a woman to talk to you or whatever it may be. And again, you build from there, and you see how in that context, he is acting as a man for that little society, and you try to build from there. So, I mean, that seems to always be the answer that I come down to. If you can't handle some designation, some status at one level of reality, try to find the level of reality that you can do it at. And of course, you can always come back down to the level of your personhood, and that's where where Jordan Peterson, him saying clean your room, actually resonates, because it's like, at the very least, you can operate at the level of your society as yourself and do something, clearly good and productive in the world, like cleaning your room, and boom, you're a man, at least as to yourself in that moment, right? You may be pretty pitiful compared to everyone else still, but you can at least do it right there. So, to me, that's the answer of what you do with the guys that can't measure up. You have to encourage them, right? Instead of casting them out and denigrating them. Of course, as men, there's a thing that part of encouragement sometimes can be teasing, can be prodding, and you have to feel out that balance. I'm not saying that you're just like, you just end up being this nice, sweet, soft, spirit, helping them along and prodding them along. And the other thing you don't do is you don't lower the bar either, right? This notion of saying, you're good enough just as you are, and here's a trophy and whatnot. I mean, that is, again, that destroys the category of manhood if you lower the bar. I mean, the great example is like the Navy SEALs. Take like the Navy SEALs, and they have this pressure to include women as part of them, and they've even said, okay, or maybe they've even been forced to say, okay, women can audition to try to get through the training of the Navy SEALs, and it's been opened up to that. Well, so far no women has made it through to become a Navy SEAL, and so there could be pressure to say, well, why don't you change the standards? But if they did, right, they would not be the Navy SEALs anymore. It would destroy the whole identity. And so that's the other thing you don't do with manhood, is you don't lower the bar, as it will, as far as the general standards of manhood. Instead, you find the level of society in which somebody can meet the bar, right? And that's a different thing. And then you encourage them to jump to a higher level of society and meet the bar at that bar. And there will be some guys that can only get so far, but at least there, they are now being productive within a sphere. They will feel better. They will be respected by those to which they've been able to be productive. And that's sometimes all you can ask in society, right? So I think that's where we'll end this series as far as what I have to say about the series. In total, we probably produced, 12 hours or more of content on what it means to be a man. So I hope we've covered it thoroughly. And of course, it doesn't mean that this is the last time I'll talk about manhood. It's just this is the last of this underlying series of defining what it means to be a man. And now today we've just kind of done this coda almost of, all right, let's talk about the exceptions. Let's talk about those that don't measure up. So, that's all I have to say today. I'm going to jump back into the stream, see if any of you have comments, questions. So if you want to have something discussed about, I'm always staying here until you're kind of done discussing. And then as far as future days, we'll go from there. We have a lot of different topics we can cover in the future. Okay, Hugo says, your videos have been very helpful to me to be a real man. I'm glad. I'm glad that, that is again, I'll say it to almost anyone that ever comments or something along those veins, is like, that really does make this all worth it. Because you see, I'm assuming behind each of you is hopefully not just some bot or something like that, but a real person really in the world. And to hear that something just said, an idea or some concept or some example actually helped somebody do something real in the real world and make something better, make a more beautiful world, you could say. That makes it all worth it. So thank you. George Japaradidze, I'm probably saying that wrong. I apologize. Says, I think you need your podcast. I should probably just throw these up in these streams, at least on a podcast, and future things like I do like this, and and that would be good. I've kind of said before that I definitely can't keep up this pace forever of doing this like every day, so I don't think I'd be very good at a daily podcast. Of course, usually what you do is you bring on guests, and that would be fun. But anyway, so yeah, I appreciate your thoughts and that you've liked this, and probably there's a way that I could start taking whatever I'm doing and at least offering it in podcast form too, for those that can more easily like listen to it while driving or something like that. Okay, Christian Nemo, Manhood explains, since you can't make people, you better make stuff. Okay, all right. So maybe say a little bit more about that. Like what exactly do you mean by that? Because it's not like I'm not understanding it completely. I'm trying to get the exact gist of how you're framing that. And then you say, do you learn some of this about encouraging men coaching soccer? Maybe a good step to being a man is to mentor other men. Yeah, for sure. So as far as that, definitely I know what you're talking about. And that is, one of the best things that came from coaching soccer is to realize how this is not easy. You know, it is not easy to try to help other people become more men. So here's another kind of principle to throw in on it, is usually you can't help somebody that doesn't want to be rescued or helped in a degree. So as a soccer coach, it's awfully nice because you kind of have this team, and one, they definitely want to improve in soccer, and so you have an opening to that. But in general, there's kind of an expectation, especially like in a high school, like an American high school, that if you've got a coach, that this is more than just a coach, and this is more than just about sports. This is about life. And so there's kind of an implicit invitation for you to, in addition to the technical training, to be able to also add in some of the life training as well. And so one, it was nice because I had that invitation, but two, I also realized how difficult it is. And maybe one of the frustrations I saw is how much I tried to offer this, and sometimes it didn't work, or maybe it appeared to work, but then maybe a year later I see some of these guys who I taught them principles, right principles, and then I see them not measure up in some way that they should have known better by that point, right? And that was difficult, and it just showed me how this, you can't just do this from one-off kind of listening to somebody talk about it or something. These are ongoing relationships that are needed out there for young men with real men, and that would kind of be the optimal thing. Is, of course, it's great if it comes from their fathers, but in any community you want the kind of ongoing relationships and being in touch with the youth, with older people, or with these kind of mentor type relationships with somebody with more experience, with someone with less. And that definitely is very difficult to do sometimes in our society. So anyway, if you get into this game, both of trying to be a man yourself, but also trying to encourage others, just kind of have that expectation that it takes some time, patience, and it doesn't always work, right? So Christian Nemo, it's the tone missing. Since you can't make people like a woman can pregnancy. Yes. I mean, that helps me when you see it, like in terms of make people, because when I think of making people, I kind of sometimes default to that agape kind of looking at thing of how people, like a baby, only becomes a real person because other people make them a person. And so, yeah, you're talking more about the woman part where she makes their body and things like that. Whereas, once a child's here in the world, it's kind of cool because men can participate in helping that child make themselves into a person. And we've talked about how you get that, that sofa or couch kind of that comes back from the hospital with you that can't do anything. It's like a slug. And then 18 years later, through your participation, your agapic love and care, that thing has become, an F-22 fighter jet. And so that's when I think of making people. I do see ways that we can all help make people, but I get your point now that since we can't do that core process, there's this other way that only women can create people and kind of create their consciousness almost, because that's all happening within them, right? only with a little bit of help from our information. Since we can't participate in that, then we better make stuff, be fruitful and productive, the things that will nourish those bodies once they come out, you could say. So yeah, I totally get your point now. It's a good point. Okay, well, it looks like we've covered that, covered things today. And so I'll just wrap up here. But thank you for being on here today, and thank you for kind of showing interest in this series. My hope with all this is that I can kind of use the framework we've created and then turn it into even more engaging kinds of content for people. And I've liked this series because already there's been a handful of opportunities of people saying, hey, could you help us create content or things in these settings? And I'm like, as long as I can, I'm happy to do those kinds of things because I love these ideas to get out and to be improved as they go. Again, I'm always about the process. Johnny Enemy Rooster, looks like you put in a comment here. Does a mentoring relationship turn into a mothering relationship? I'm a bit confused on that because in a sense, you are dependent upon a mentor to actualize kind of like you're dependent on society. Say it could, right? It could, but that's where there's a difference between a mothering relationship and a fathering relationship, right? And that really comes out in a family. Like when a child's born, it is the mother primarily that the child's going to have a relationship with. When they're born, immediately they are part of the mother still. Yeah, they came out of her, but it's like much more like a kangaroo where they are utterly dependent on her primarily. And there's all sorts of things happening between her and that child to develop it. And not much changes, even over the first number of years through this incredibly long process of maturation in a human child. And so we've noticed, like in our family, my wife still focuses primarily on kind of the development of our children, their education and whatnot, especially through like 6th grade, which would be about 11 or 11 years old or 12 years old here in the United States. But then from that point, right when puberty is often coming along, you start to see as a father that you start having very special ways that in your fathering role of things you have to offer your children that is not mothering at all, right? You're not there trying to cradle them and nurse them with your milk, right? Even in a a metaphorical sense. In many ways, you are masculine. You have this masculine type of growth that you can offer your children, which very often comes with defining an identity, right? And setting up a vision of what they want to become and achieve, and then heading out towards that vision and having you help in that process. Where, again, if anything, you say, could it become a mothering relationship? Again, you're not nurturing and it's not this gentle thing. Of course, you can be gentle, but you're trying to, kind of light that fire in them, if you will, that I'm struggling for the right words, but that kind of launches them off into something higher, right? And so you're trying to not keep them as they are and safe and protected. Here's another way of looking at it, right? This is probably the best way, kind of just conceptually, to look at it, that the mother is there to make them feel safe and protected as they're nurtured and grow in the home, but they reach, every child needs to leave that place. This is the garden, right? The mother is like the Garden of Eden. She is the garden, providing for them in this safe, wonderful place, right? And you're the person that's trying to prepare them to exit the garden and face the world, the dangerous, lonely world of thorns and weeds and things like that, but also turn that world into a great world, and in some way make it back to the top of the garden. The garden's a mountain. Make it back to the top of the mountain, having become a more developed person. So hopefully you can see how that's the nature of a mentoring relationship. It's completely different from that of a mothering, nurturing relationship. So it's a great it's a great comment there, and I'm glad you brought that up because it allows you to kind of make that one of these stark distinctions of what a man in general has to offer people in terms of their person making, in terms of their development. It's not to say that a woman couldn't do that, but it's kind of like, what people are especially good at, or what people might especially have to offer. And this is something that men have to offer, right? Okay, and Anneke de Bruin says, thanks for doing this. Again, I'm sorry if I'm getting your name right, and really appreciate this. I'm glad to have you, and glad that you're commenting, because I think I haven't seen your name before. So if, with every one of these that I do, if I see a new name out there, again, that's very motivational to me, to see that new people are paying attention. So thanks you for being on here. Okay, with that, I'm going to sign off here. I'll be back tomorrow, most likely with a discussion with my wife. I said we were going to bring her on again. And then I've got this video essay that I'm working on this whole week. And my plan right now is to release it sometime Saturday. And that is on the waterfront. And I'm excited to get your feedback on getting that done and out there. So this is Gary signing off from Mission Top. We'll see you back tomorrow.